For Comedy Hype News, I'm Dom Smith. When hip-hop first emerged onto the scene as the new, exciting genre of music, it took the world by storm. Rapping, turntable scratching, and breakdancing became the new hot thing that all the cool kids were doing. Word spread around pretty quickly. However, as fast as hip-hop caught on, not everyone was welcoming to it. Hip-hop has constantly received a negative reception from more conservative music listeners. Its vulgar language, vividly descriptive sex acts, and the glamorization of violence are what's the most criticized. Def Comedy Jam premiered in 1992, and it received the same complaints. Before Def Comedy Jam, audiences hadn't seen comedians on TV use language the way it's used on Def Jam. The show was a far cry from the cookie-cutter suit-and-tie comedians that stood in front of a brick wall at the comic strip. Hip-hop and rap have now become popular music in 2020, just like Def Comedy Jam is widely celebrated now for making a way for black comedians in the 90s. Here's why the mainstream didn't respect Def Comedy Jam. It all started when Russell Simmons teamed up with Rick Rubin to work for Def Jam. Simmons toured dance clubs around the country, where many clubs held a comedy night during the week. I could see there was this whole subculture developing. The arena was getting bigger and bigger, but there was no one to expose these people or take it to the next level. It seemed like the natural thing to do. The subculture that Simmons was referring to was the Chitlin Circuit. The Chitlin Circuit was performing arts for blacks. The circuit provided a safe haven for black artists, musicians, comedians, and other entertainers to perform and gather during Jim Crow and segregation. The comedy shows that took place at the Chitlin Circuit were raw, gritty, and full of energy, much like what you saw each week on Def Comedy Jam. Comedians like Red Fox, Lunel, and Bernie Mac all came from this circuit. The Comedy Act Theater in LA and the Uptown Comedy Corner in Harlem were home to these performances. Full of bravado, swag, and grandiosity, much like hip-hop, black comedy was definitely its own style that had yet to be seen by the mainstream. Leaving behind the observational jokes about airline food, Def Comedy Jam operated in a style close to Eddie Murphy, relying on being confident and cool as opposed to anxiety and self-deprecation. What Simmons tried to do was take the same principles that made hip-hop so great and apply those same tactics to create a comedy show. Def Comedy Jam premiered on July 1st, 1992, and immediately impacted the landscape of stand-up comedy. According to the Los Angeles Times, Def Comedy Jam was the most popular late-night comedy show in HBO history, regularly averaging 1.7 million viewers a week. Def Comedy Jam provided a platform for black comedians whose material was just a little too raw for the big four television networks or even basic cable. HBO was literally the only channel at the time that could have hosted this kind of content. George Carlin's 7 dirty words you can't say on television were a common practice on Def Comedy Jam. In addition to the vulgarity, sex jokes were the normality. The more graphic the joke, the more the audience would erupt.
I couldn't give him no blowjob. My big ass lips, his little old dick. It wouldn't work. That'd be like trying to give a whale a tic-tac, motherfucker. That shit wouldn't work.
Everyone who saw the show didn't fall in love with the language and content. As widely praised as Def Comedy Jam was, the show had its fair share of critics, Bill Cosby being the most notable. As we all know, Cosby isn't the biggest fan of humor that contains graphic language. The most obvious example includes Eddie Murphy's bit in Raw, where he tells the story of how Cosby called and chastised him for swearing. When it came to Def Comedy Jam, Cosby said, "Certainly if you look at Def Comedy Jam, you have to ask, is D.W. Griffith really jumping up and down saying, 'See, I told you, I was right'?" D.W. Griffith was an American filmmaker, most known for directing the film Birth of a Nation. In the movie, Griffith used white actors to put on blackface, and they were portrayed as having low intelligence. Cosby felt that Def Jam was enforcing the same stereotypes that Griffith did more than 75 years later. It's important instead that we try to push the minds of those who study English literature and American literature and try and put that on television. Even those involved with the show have claimed they've had some reservations. There are things that I find really difficult, being an old-timer in television. I'm conditioned to think of television as a forum for ideas, but I still have a hard time with the totally raw stuff. I could say a few have been in bad taste, but we have an obligation to air it and put it on totally uncensored. If it's funny to our audience, no matter how dirty it is, we use it. We know that our crowd is a very representative crowd. In 1994, the New York Times dedicated an entire piece to all of Def Jam's criticism, with one critic calling it reprehensible. Can black comedians perform without swearing was a question that was commonly asked.
You don't understand. get her, you mother.
In 1994, Greg Braxton of the LA Times covered a story about the landscape of black comedy, comparing and contrasting its impact. Comedians acknowledged the groundbreaking nature of Def Comedy Jam and praised the series for helping black comedians make inroads. But they and others maintain that the show's edgy style of humor has promoted an overemphasis among black comedians on a raunchy, in-your-face style of comedy rather than more subtle, insightful humor. Much of the Def Jam humor is degrading to women, employs racial epithets, and uses stereotypes that portray black men and women as oversexed, loud, and profane. And young audiences, particularly those who like rap music, now expect black comics to perform Def Jam style material. Audiences who have been attending comedy clubs haven't changed, but there is a new audience out there, the hip hop audience, and the Def Jam stuff is what they want to see. Many comedians didn't expect the show to have the impact that it did. In 1993, Dave Chappelle did an interview for the Washington Post and said, "I didn't know the show was going to be as huge as it was. I kinda regret being dirty on the show. If I had known so many people were watching, I might have represented myself differently." When it came to discussing what the show did for other comedians, Chappelle said, "It kinda changed a lot of things for black comics, where now both black and white people expect you to be dirty. It's not fair, man, because now it's limiting everyone." Def Jam has definitely had an influence on the expectations of audiences and club owners towards black comedians. You have to remember, when Def Jam started, it was huge. It was a lot of white people's first introduction to that kind of stand-up comedy. And that's what they thought it was all about. I found out when I was touring that, in a lot of people's minds, especially young people, your comedy was not as colorful if you were less blue. And club owners, when they would see that I'm young and black, would be reluctant to deal with me saying, "He's one of those Def Jam comics." Now, when you were labeled a Def Jam comedian, you were subject to a certain stigma. Unnecessary swearing, yelling at the audience, and vivid sexual movements were expected of you. The assumptions were unfair. Getting known simply as a Def Jam comedian could hinder you in the long run, which speaks to the limiting that Chappelle was referring to. Comedian AJ Jamal, who spent some time as a cast member on In Living Color, also had some harsh criticisms of Def Comedy Jam. With Richard Pryor, you never knew the cursing was there. It was brilliant. Now it's F this and F that, N this and N that. Like, where's the joke? These guys don't even introduce themselves. They just start right off saying those words. Why does it have to be so violent? And why does there have to be so much bad language? In response to all the negative criticism that the show received, Simmons said, "Black comics have a real forum on Def Jam, not these other places. No matter what anyone says, it's an honest expression of our culture. There is no emphasis on being dirty. The emphasis is on being honest." When something is polarizing, it has both a positive and negative response, and that's what makes it so great. The ability to challenge audiences while pushing the culture forward is something that can go unappreciated. Def Jam stands out from any other stand-up comedy show out there. We can all name our favorite moments like Chris Tucker and Eddie Griffin's Michael Jackson impressions.
Girl, you been out here all day and all you got is a $100 bill? Ah!
To Martin's infamous roasts. We're grateful for the fearlessness of Russell Simmons and the courage in creating Def Comedy Jam. When Simmons, Stan Lathan, and Bob Sumner came together to make the show, they knew the backlash they were going to get, but went through with it anyway because they knew people would talk about it forever. Stay up to date with the latest news in comedy by subscribing here to our YouTube channel and follow Comedy Hype across all social media. For Comedy Hype News, I'm Dom Smith.